It would, I think, in this whole training series be a bit remiss not to give a quick overview of some of the most basic math functions. Add, divide, multiply, subtract and so on should all be pretty straightforward what they do. They just take number inputs and add or divide whatever them together. The one thing I do want to point out that these make a perfect example of, the same thing crops up in other nodes of course, but these simple four help me get the point across really clear. Lots of these things just have, of course, A and B, A and B, A and B inputs, and of course all look very much the same. And once you get going with nodes, you can become a little connection happy at times. And the problem with that is that some of these don't care which way they're connected and some do. Of course, add and multiply, connect your two numbers any way round you like and you always get the same result. Divide and subtract, of course, you do not. It's obvious and elementary, I know. The reason I point it out is for those who are just generally less familiar working in the node editor. It's a great opportunity to make a really simple mistake. So keep your eye on things like that. Okay, the abs node, absolute, basically all it does is derive what they call the absolute value, which is the same whether positive or negative. So the abs of 6 is 6, the abs of negative 6 is 6. So basically as a function, any positive number that comes in comes out positive, any negative number that comes in comes out positive. Ceil, or ceiling, this takes any fractional number and rounds it up to the next nearest whole number. So 0 point anything becomes 1, 1 point anything becomes 2, and so on. So you can take something like a procedural and get a harsh, contrasted version out, kill off all the grey, or rather raise all of the grey to white. Conversely, you have floor, which does the opposite. It performs a round down, and so all of the grey is dragged down to black. Max and min, both similar. Max takes two values, A and B, and it spits out whichever of the two is the biggest. Min takes two values, A and B, and spits out whichever is the smallest, as well as anything above. So, for instance, a procedural again, taken into here, when the max is set to 0, then anything above 0 is transferred through. But of course we can clamp the base, so we can go to 0.2, and the darkest anything becomes is 0.2. So this can be used as a black level, black input level. And min basically does the opposite, so of course if we wanted the whole thing it would be 1. And lower levels drop the whites down. So it can be used for numerical operations and of course texture operations. Clamp again similar. What this will do is make a cutoff between a high and low value. So if we enter 0.2, 0.8, then anything above 0.8 is clamped down, anything below 0.2 is clamped up, and we get just the little grey in between left over. Clamp is also useful in situations where you've got something that switches round between returning a positive and negative value, and you always want to keep it on the positive side. Kind of like a nodal version of the position and rotation limits available in the motion panel. Pow, raised to the power of function, so something times itself so many times. 4 to the power of 3 is 4 times 4 times 4. 3 to the power of 5 is 3 times 3 times 3 times 3 times 3, and so on. Obviously, something to the power of 1 is just itself. Anything to the power of 0.5 is its square root, and of course anything to the power of 2 is its square. Sine is kind of similar to what abs was, except that it does it on both sides. So any positive that you feed into sine comes out as a negative, and any negative you feed in comes out as a positive. It mirrors values, essentially. It often comes in most useful when you've got multiple things using the same network, and you're copying and pasting between them and making the individual adjustments as needed. On some copies you may need the opposite side of a motion or rotation or whatever else. Sine is just a quick and easy way to flip yourself. Invert, some people do think by the name, does what sine would do as well. It doesn't. What invert does is simply flip values between 0 and 1. That's really all it's good for or used for. So when the value entered is 1, you get 0, and when the value entered is 0, you get 1. If you give it any number higher than 1, then the value remains 0, and if you give it any number lower than 0, then the value remains 1. It really is only good for flipping 1 and 0, and it is, essentially, no different than hitting the invert checkbox. It's most useful where you're using procedurals or image maps, and you want the regular version to be driving one thing, perhaps diffuse, but then you want the opposite or inverse version to be driving another, say reflection, to keep them balanced. Now, we're not going to talk too much about vectors in this video, but I am going to show you just some of their simple math nodes. Of course, remember that vectors are triplet values, and when you have these math operations going on vectors, they essentially just work on a scalar by scalar basis. So it's x plus x, and y plus y, and z plus z. It's just adding three different scalars together. Add 4, of course, is the same, except it's adding 4 sets of 3 scalars. Multiply, again, the same thing. Divide, subtract, and of course, because of that, you can just feed good old scalars into them, or integers, or any other number. And when doing that, you do just, of course, override all 3. But otherwise, those basic functions of the vector math nodes work exactly the same as their scalar counterparts. And all in all, that covers just the basic set of math nodes that you'll find most helpful to be fully comfortable with, because you'll see them thrown up time and again throughout this.